He came to lay flowers on his ex-wife's grave, then froze. Two boys knelt there, crying, whispering "Mommy," and when they looked up, they had his eyes. The Mafia boss, who feared nothing, suddenly couldn't breathe, because if those boys were who he thought they were, someone had been hiding them from him all along. Before we go deeper, don't forget to subscribe, because what happens next will leave you speechless. This isn't just another Mafia story. It's a secret buried for years, and you're about to uncover every compelling piece of it. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you don't miss the truth that changes everything. The morning mist hung low over the cemetery like unspoken guilt, clinging to marble headstones and iron gates as Harold Bruce's black Mercedes rolled to a silent stop along the gravel path. The air smelled of wet earth and cut grass, heavy with the kind of stillness that only exists in places where people come to remember what they've lost. Harold stepped out slowly, his polished leather shoes crunching against the stone pathway. He wore a sharp blue suit, tailored, expensive, the uniform of a man who commanded rooms and controlled destinies. But here, surrounded by rows of the dead, the expensive fabric felt like armor that no longer fit. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples now, his jaw set in that familiar hard line that had made grown men confess their sins. Yet his hands, as he adjusted his cufflinks, trembled slightly. It had been 5 years since he'd last seen Grace. 5 years since the night she walked out of his penthouse with nothing but a suitcase and tears streaming down her face, begging him one last time to choose her over the empire he'd built in blood and broken bones. He'd watched her go from the window, a glass of scotch in his hand, and told himself she'd come back. She always came back, except this time, she didn't. He hadn't known she was sick. The news came not through his network of informants or his well-paid lawyers, but from a small obituary in a county newspaper that one of his men happened to see. Grace Eleanor Mitchell, 34, beloved teacher and devoted mother, passed peacefully. The words devoted mother had meant nothing to him then, just another detail in a stranger's life story. Grace had no children when she left him. He was certain of that. Harold had missed the funeral, couldn't bring himself to go. What would he say? That he was sorry? That he'd chosen power over love and had been living with that choice every day since? Some truths were too heavy to speak aloud, even for a man who trafficked in secrets. But the weight of it had followed him through sleepless nights and silent mornings until, finally, he couldn't carry it anymore. So here he was, 3 weeks after her burial, making the 2-hour drive from the city to this quiet cemetery on the edge of a town he'd never thought about again. He told himself he just needed to say goodbye, to close a chapter. Nothing more. He walked slowly through the rows of graves, his 2 bodyguards remaining by the car. Even Harold Bruce knew some walks had to be taken alone. The last time he'd been in a cemetery, Grace had been beside him, her hand trembling in his as they buried her father. He'd promised her then that he'd protect her from ever feeling that kind of pain again. That was one more promise he'd broken. He found her grave beneath an old oak tree, its branches creating patterns of shadow and light across the simple gray headstone. Grace Eleanor Mitchell, the name carved in clean, modest letters. No mention of him, no trace that she'd ever been his wife. He supposed that was fitting, but Harold never made it to the grave, because kneeling beside it, small and impossibly fragile against the sprawling cemetery, were 2 little boys. They couldn't have been more than 6 years old, dressed in oversized black hoodies despite the summer warmth, their small shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. One clutched a handful of dandelions, the kind of wildflowers kids pick because they don't know better. The other held something crumpled in his fist, maybe a drawing or a letter. Harold stopped mid-step, his breath catching. They were whispering to the headstone, voices too soft to hear, wiping their eyes with their sleeves in that unself-conscious way children cry when they think no one is watching. Something about them made Harold's chest tighten, something familiar he couldn't name. He took another step forward, and the gravel shifted beneath his shoe. Both boys looked up sharply, their tear-streaked faces turning toward him with identical expressions of surprise and fear. And Harold's world stopped. Their eyes, deep brown, almost black, were his eyes. The shape of their faces, the way their brows drew together in confusion, the stubborn set of their small jaws. He'd seen that face every day in the mirror for 42 years. "I'm sorry," Harold managed, his voice rougher than he intended. "I didn't mean to startle you." The boys stared at him, uncertain. One of them, slightly taller, maybe by a minute or two, spoke first. "Are you here to visit someone?" Harold's throat felt like sandpaper. "Yes, I knew Grace, a long time ago." The smaller boy's eyes widened. "You knew our mommy?" "Our mommy." The words hit Harold like a bullet he never saw coming. "This is her grave," the taller boy said quietly, gesturing to the headstone with the hand holding the wilted dandelions. "We come every Sunday. Aunt Martha brings us." Harold couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The mathematics were screaming in his head. Grace left 5 years ago. These boys were 6, maybe just turned, which meant, "How old are you?" he heard himself ask, dropping slowly to one knee so he was at their eye level. "6," they said in perfect unison. "We just had our birthday last month." 6 years old. Grace had left 5.5 years ago. She'd been pregnant with twins, his twins, and she'd never told him. Harold stared at their faces, the curve of their cheeks, the exact shade of their eyes, the way one of them chewed his bottom lip when nervous. The same way Harold did when he was thinking. There was no denying it, no possible alternative explanation. These weren't just Grace's sons, they were his. Harold knelt there in the cemetery dirt, his expensive suit forgotten, his empire meaningless, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him as 2 pairs of innocent eyes watched him with curiosity and something else, something that looked almost like hope. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time in 20 years, Harold Bruce, the man who had ordered executions without blinking, who had built a criminal empire and calculated ruthlessness, had absolutely no idea what to do next. The only thing he knew for certain was that everything had just changed, and there was no going back. But understanding who they were would require understanding who Grace had been and why she'd run from him in the first place. Harold would spend the next 24 hours piecing together the truth he'd been too blind to see, and what he discovered would break him long before it could begin to rebuild him. The penthouse felt colder than usual. Harold stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a crystal glass of scotch untouched in his hand. Behind him, his consigliere Vincent moved quietly through the room, dismissing the armed men who'd been stationed there since Harold's return. The marble floors gleamed under recessed lighting. Expensive art hung on walls that had witnessed more confessions than a church. But none of it meant anything anymore. All Harold could see were 2 pairs of eyes that looked exactly like his. "You've been standing there for an hour," Vincent said, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence. "You want to tell me what happened at that cemetery, or do I need to guess?" Harold didn't turn around. "Grace had children." "I know, it was in the obituary, survived by twin sons." "They're mine." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had already been fired. Vincent exhaled slowly. "Harold, are you sure? Because that's not something you can just—" "I saw them, Vincent." Harold's voice cracked in a way it hadn't in decades. "I looked at them and saw myself at 6 years old. There's no question." Vincent was quiet for a long moment, then softer. "She left 5 years ago, Harold, the night you chose to retaliate against the Castellano family, instead of walking away like she begged you to. You remember that?" Harold remembered, the blood on his hands, Grace's voice breaking as she screamed that she couldn't watch him become a monster. The sound of the door closing behind her, the last time he ever saw her alive. "She was pregnant," Harold whispered, "and I never knew." "Maybe she didn't want you to know," Vincent said quietly. "You think about why that might be?" The question was a knife between his ribs. Harold didn't sleep that night. By dawn, he was back in his car, driving the same 2-hour route to the cemetery, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Could they really be his? What if he was wrong? The possibility that he'd been a father for 6 years without knowing felt like drowning in open air. When he arrived, the morning sun was just breaking over the headstones. And there they were again, the 2 boys, kneeling at Grace's grave. But this time they weren't alone. An older woman stood beside them, her silver hair pulled back severely, her posture rigid. She wore a simple black dress and the kind of expression that could cut glass. Harold recognized her immediately from old photographs. Martha, Grace's older sister. The one who'd never approved of him, the one who'd been right all along. He approached slowly, and Martha's head snapped up. Her eyes widened, then narrowed into something close to hatred. "You," she hissed, stepping protectively in front of the boys. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," Harold said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. "About them. You need to leave." Martha's voice shook with fury. "You've done enough damage, Harold. Grace spent her entire life hiding from your world, trying to give those boys a chance at something normal, something safe. Are they mine?" The question tore out of him. Martha's face went pale. The boys watched silently, confused and frightened. "Answer me, Martha. Are those boys my sons?" For a moment, she looked like she might deny it, might send him away with a lie to protect what little Grace had left behind. But then her shoulders sagged, and Harold saw something break in her expression. "She didn't want you to know," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She was terrified you'd take them into your life, into that world of violence and death. She wanted them to have a childhood, Harold, a real one." "But are they mine?" Harold's voice cracked. Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Harold, they're yours." The world tilted. Harold's glass heart, the one he'd encased in ice and violence and power for so many years, finally cracked straight down the middle. He staggered backward, his hand reaching for something to steady himself against, finding only air. He had sons, 2 sons, and Grace had loved them enough to keep them from him. What kind of man had he become that the woman who once loved him would rather raise their children in secret than let him be their father? What do you think? Was Grace right to hide them? Drop your thoughts below. And if this story is hitting you somewhere deep, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Behind him, one of the boys, the smaller one, whispered to his brother, "Is that man okay?" Harold closed his eyes. "No," he wanted to say. "No, I'm not okay. I haven't been okay for 5 years, maybe longer." But when he opened them again and looked at Martha, there was something new in his expression. Not the cold calculation of a mafia boss, not the casual cruelty of a man used to getting what he wanted, just desperation. "I need to know everything," he said hoarsely. "Please." And for the first time since Grace had died, Martha saw not the monster her sister had run from, but the broken man she'd once tried to save. If you're still here, hit that subscribe button, because what Harold discovers next will change everything. And trust me, you don't want to miss how a man like him tries to become a father. 96% of you are watching without subscribing. Be part of the 4% who actually care how this story ends. Martha didn't invite him inside. She met Harold at the door of Grace's small rented house 3 days later, a worn cardboard box clutched against her chest like a shield. The house was modest, pale yellow siding, a tiny porch with a rusted metal chair, flower boxes that Grace had probably planted herself. It was the kind of place Harold's men wouldn't have looked at twice. The kind of place where someone could disappear, where Grace had disappeared. "I shouldn't be doing this," Martha said, her voice tight, but Grace wrote instructions. If you ever came looking, she wanted you to understand. She thrust the box toward him. "These are hers, her journals, letters she never sent. Take them and go, Harold, and if you have any decency left, you'll read them before you decide what kind of father you think you can be." Harold took the box carefully, as if it might shatter. "Thank you." Martha's eyes glistened. "Don't thank me. Just don't break those boys the way you broke her." The door closed before he could respond. Harold didn't open the box until he was back in his penthouse, alone in his office with the door locked and his phone silenced. Vincent had tried to speak to him when he arrived, but Harold had walked past him without a word, carrying the box like it contained evidence of his own execution. Maybe it did. He sat at his desk, the same desk where he'd signed orders that ended lives, moved millions, and built an empire, and pulled out the first journal. It was small, bound in faded blue fabric, the edges worn from being held. Grace's handwriting covered the first page, dated 6 years ago. March 14th, I'm pregnant. I took 3 tests this morning, and they all say the same thing. Twins. The doctor confirmed it this afternoon. I sat in that sterile room and heard 2 heartbeats through the monitor, and all I could think was, I can't tell him. How can I bring 2 innocent lives into Harold's world? How can I watch my children grow up surrounded by guns and blood and men who smile while they destroy people? I loved him once. God, I loved him so much, I thought it would be enough to change him. But love doesn't stomp bullets. It doesn't erase the screams I heard that night when he chose revenge over me. I have to leave. For them, even if it breaks me. Harold's hands trembled as he turned to the page. The entries continued. Grace documenting her escape, settling in this small town under her maiden name, finding work as a teacher at the local elementary school. She wrote about the boy's birth, about holding Liam and Leo for the first time, and promising them a life free from fear. She wrote about her loneliness. June 2nd. Leo said his first word today, Mama. Liam clapped like it was a miracle, and it was, but I sat on the floor of our tiny apartment afterward and cried because there was no one to share it with, no one to call. Harold would have loved this moment, the old Harold, the one who used to smile, but that man is gone, buried under everything he chose instead of us. Harold's vision blurred. Further in, the entries grew shorter, weaker, the dates more sporadic. October 8th. Doctor says it's stage 3. Pancreatic cancer. I've known something was wrong for months, but I kept pretending I just needed rest. The boys are only faint. They need me, but I'm so tired. And the pain, I need to write this down in case I don't get to say it. If Harold ever finds them, if somehow, someday, he comes looking, tell him to love them enough for both of us. Tell him they deserve better than what we had. Tell him love doesn't make you weak. It's the only thing that ever made him human. The journal slipped from Harold's hands and hit the desk. He sat frozen, staring at Grace's words until they blurred into nothing. Then slowly something inside him collapsed. The walls he'd built, the armor he'd worn, the cold distance he'd maintained between himself and every human emotion. A sound escaped him, raw, broken. Harold Bruce, the man who'd stared down enemies without flinching, who'd built an empire on ruthlessness and fear, buried his face in his hands and wept. He cried for Grace, who died alone because he'd chosen power over her love. He cried for the 6 years he'd missed. First words, first steps, birthdays, bedtime stories. He cried for 2 little boys who'd never known their father because their father had been too much of a monster to deserve them. The sobs tore through him like bullets he'd fired coming back to find their target. His shoulders shook. His breath came in ragged gasps. And for the first time in 20 years, Harold Bruce felt the full weight of what he'd become. Outside his office, Vincent stood with his hand raised to knock, then slowly lowered it. Through the thick door, he could hear sounds he'd never heard before. He stepped back quietly and told the other men to leave the boss alone. Some kinds of pain had to be faced in solitude, and some reckonings couldn't be avoided, only survived. Harold made the call from a burner phone at 2 a.m., standing on his balcony while the city slept below. I need a DNA test. Private, untraceable, he said to the voice on the other end, a doctor who owed him favors that could never be repaid in money alone. How private? The kind that doesn't exist on paper. 48 hours later, Harold had the samples, strands of hair collected from the cemetery grass where the boys had knelt, his own blood drawn in a downtown clinic under a false name. He handed everything to the doctor in an underground parking garage. No words exchanged, just a manila envelope passing between them like contraband. The wait was agony. Harold went through the motions of his empire, meetings with his lieutenants, calls about shipments and territories, the usual machinery of organized crime grinding forward. But his mind was elsewhere, trapped in a loop of 2 faces that looked like his, 2 voices asking if he knew their mommy. When the call finally came, Harold was alone in his office, staring at Grace's journal on his desk. It's a match, the doctor said simply. 99.9%. They're yours, Harold. Harold didn't respond. Couldn't. The phone slipped slightly in his hand. Harold, are you there? Yeah, he managed. Thank you. He ended the call and sat in stunned silence, the confirmation hanging in the air like smoke. He'd known, of course he'd known from the moment he saw them, but knowing and knowing were two different things. He had sons, two 6-year-old boys who'd been breathing and laughing and crying in this world while he'd been building empires and breaking bones, completely unaware that he'd left behind the only thing that actually mattered. Harold called Martha the next morning. She was resistant, suspicious, but eventually agreed to let him meet the boys, supervised, at a public park for 1 hour. If you upset them, she warned, you'll never see them again. I don't care what your DNA says. The park was small, tucked between residential streets, with rusted swings and a wooden playset that had seen better years. Harold arrived early, dressed down in jeans and a simple black shirt. No suit, no bodyguards visible, though Vincent watched from a car 2 blocks away. When Martha arrived with Liam and Leo, Harold's breath caught. In the daylight, the resemblance was even more striking. They had his eyes, his stubborn jawline, even the way they walked, cautious but curious, taking in the world like it might surprise them. Boys, Martha said gently, this is Harold. He knew your mommy a long time ago. Liam, the slightly taller twin, studied him with unsettling intensity. You were at the cemetery. I was, Harold said, kneeling down to their level. I wanted to visit her, to say goodbye. Leo stepped closer, tilting his head. You look like us. Harold's throat tightened. Yeah, I guess I do. Did you love our mommy? Liam asked suddenly, his voice small but direct. The question hit Harold like a bullet to the chest. Yes, he said hoarsely. Very much. Was she happy? Leo's eyes searched his face. Before she got sick, was she happy? Was she happy? Harold thought of Grace's journal, of her loneliness, of the life she'd lived hiding from him. She loved you both more than anything in the world, he said carefully. That made her happy. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The boys seemed to accept this. After a moment, Leo asked, Do you like ice cream? Harold blinked, thrown by the shift. Yeah, I do. Can we get some? Liam asked, glancing at Martha. Please. Martha looked like she wanted to refuse. But something in Harold's expression stopped her. She nodded reluctantly. The ice cream shop was a small place 2 streets over, the kind with checkered floors and handwritten menu boards. Harold felt absurdly out of place. This man who'd negotiated million-dollar deals in back rooms, now standing in line behind 2 6-year-olds debating chocolate versus vanilla. They sat at a corner table, the twins attacking their cones with the focused intensity only children possess. Harold barely touched his. Why don't you smile? Leo asked suddenly, vanilla ice cream on his upper lip. Harold paused. What? You look sad, even when you're not sad. How come? How did you explain decades of choices and consequences to a 6-year-old? I guess I forgot how, Harold said quietly. Liam studied him seriously. Mommy used to say smiling is like exercise. You have to practice or you get bad at it. Something cracked in Harold's chest, small but significant. He felt the corners of his mouth lift slightly, barely a smile, but the twins noticed immediately. There, Leo said triumphantly, see, you just needed practice. And despite everything, despite the weight of his past and the impossibility of his present, Harold laughed, just a small sound, rusty and unfamiliar, but real. For the first time in years, Harold Bruce felt almost human. But across town, in a dimly lit restaurant where the Vaselli family conducted business, a phone call was being made. You're sure? Carlo Vaselli asked, his scarred hand wrapped around a glass of wine. Positive, boss. Harold Bruce has 2 kids. Twins. Just found out about them himself. Carlo smiled slowly. Interesting. The untouchable Harold Bruce finally has something to lose. He set down his glass. Keep eyes on them, and when the time is right, we'll remind him exactly how expensive weakness can be. The shadows were already gathering, and Harold, laughing with his sons over melting ice cream, had no idea the price of his newfound humanity was already being calculated. The whispers started small, in smoky back rooms, in private booths, across encrypted phone lines and coded messages. Word spread through the underworld like blood in water. Harold Bruce has children, twins, 6 years old. For 20 years, Harold had been untouchable, a man with no weaknesses, no leverage, nothing to lose. He'd built his empire on that invincibility, on the certainty that threats meant nothing to someone who cared about nothing. But now everything had changed, and his enemies were circling. Carlo Vaselli sat in his restaurant's back office, a cigar smoldering between his fingers, listening to his nephew's report with growing interest. The boys live with their aunt, Grace's sister, Martha. Small house on Maple Street, minimal security. Bruce visits them twice a week now, always alone, no guards visible. He's trying to play civilian, Carlo mused, smoke curling from his lips. How touching. How stupid. He leaned forward. Put eyes on them. I want to know everywhere those children go. When Harold Bruce finally has something worth protecting, that's when we take everything from him. His nephew hesitated. You want us to move on, kids? Carlo's smile didn't reach his eyes. I want Harold to understand what it feels like to lose something irreplaceable. What happens after that? Well, that depends on how quickly he learns. Harold had just picked up Liam and Leo from Martha's house, their third visit this week. The boys were animated in the back seat, Leo describing a drawing he'd made at school, while Liam explained the rules of a game Harold had never heard of. For 40 minutes, Harold just listened, stealing glances in the rearview mirror at two faces that were gradually becoming familiar, almost comfortable. Then he noticed the black SUV. It had been behind them for 3 turns now, maintaining a precise distance. Harold's instincts, honed by decades of survival, screamed a warning. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. Hey boys, he said, keeping his voice calm. Let's play a game, okay? I want you both to lie down in the back seat. Pretend you're hiding from pirates. Pirates? Liam's eyes lit up. Yep, and you have to stay down until I say it's safe. Can you do that? They scrambled down eagerly, giggling. Harold's eyes flicked to the mirror. The SUV had accelerated, closing the gap. Through the tinted windshield, he could see 2 figures in the front seats. His blood went cold, then hot. Every instinct from 20 years of street wars ignited. Harold yanked the wheel right, cutting across 2 lanes and shooting down a side street. The SUV followed. Tires squealed as Harold accelerated, his mind calculating routes and exits with the precision of muscle memory. Are the pirates close? Leo's muffled voice asked from the floor. Stay down, Harold commanded, his voice harder now. He whipped the car left into an alley, barely wide enough for the vehicle, then burst out onto a main road and merged into heavy traffic. The SUV struggled to keep pace, trapped behind a delivery truck. Harold took the opportunity, cutting across an intersection just as the light turned red, putting distance between them. 5 minutes later, he pulled into a crowded shopping center parking lot and killed the engine, his heart hammering against his ribs. Can we get up now? Liam asked. Harold forced his breathing to steady. Yeah, game's over. You both did great. They popped up, oblivious to the danger they'd just been in, already talking about ice cream rewards for their excellent pirate hiding. But Harold's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. They'd come for his sons. Before he'd even figured out how to be a father, his past had already marked them for death. Martha's fury was nuclear. You brought this to them, she screamed, standing on her porch as Harold carried the sleeping boys inside. Your world, your violence, your goddamn enemies. Grace died protecting them from this, and you show up and destroy everything in 3 weeks. Martha, no. Tears streamed down her face. You're a curse, Harold. Everything you touch, Desai, stay away from them. Stay away from my nephews before you get them killed. Harold set Leo down gently on the couch, his jaw tight. I can protect them. Like you protected Grace? The words were a knife. She ran from you, Harold. She chose poverty and hiding over being your wife because she knew what you are. And now you want to play father? They're my sons. They're targets now because of you. Martha's voice broke. Please, Harold. If you have any love left in that dead heart of yours, walk away. Let them live. Harold stared at her, then at the boys sleeping peacefully, unaware of the war brewing around them. Every logical part of him knew Martha was right. The safest thing for Liam and Leo was for him to disappear. But he'd already lost 6 years. He couldn't lose them again. Harold returned to the cemetery at midnight, alone. He knelt before Grace's grave, the marble cold under his fingers. The city was silent except for distant sirens, the soundtrack of the world he'd built. "I don't know what I'm doing," he whispered to the headstone. "I don't know how to be what they need, but they're mine, Grace. They're ours, and I can't walk away." The wind moved through the trees overhead. "I'll protect them," Harold said, his voice hardening with resolve. "Even if it means burning everything down. The empire, the business, all of it. I'll tear it all apart if that's what it takes to keep them safe." He pressed his forehead against the cold stone. "I'm sorry I couldn't be this man when you were alive, but I swear on everything I won't let them become collateral damage for my sins, whatever it costs." The promise hung in the night air, binding and absolute. Harold Bruce had finally found something worth more than power, and he would go to war with the entire underworld to protect it. The lawyer arrived unannounced on a gray Tuesday morning. Harold was in his office reviewing security protocols, new routes for the Maz, safe houses, trusted men he could position around Martha's neighborhood, when Vincent knocked and entered with a puzzled expression. "There's a woman here. Says she's Grace's estate attorney. Has something that's supposed to be delivered to you personally." Harold's head snapped up. "Grace's attorney? That's what she says." The woman who entered was middle-aged, professional, carrying a leather briefcase that looked expensive but worn. She introduced herself as Margaret Chen, extended her hand briefly, then got straight to business. "Mr. Bruce, I've been holding something for you per my client's instructions. Grace Mitchell came to me 8 months before her death and left specific orders." She pulled out a sealed envelope, cream-colored and slightly thick. "She said if you ever made contact with the children, I was to deliver this immediately." Harold stared at the envelope like it might burn him. "She knew I'd come?" Margaret's expression softened slightly. "She said you would. Eventually. She made me promise to wait, no matter how long it took." She placed the envelope on his desk. "I'll show myself out." After she left, Harold sat motionless, staring at the envelope. His name was written across the front in Grace's handwriting. Elegant, careful, unmistakably hers. His hands trembled as he broke the seal. "Harold, if you were reading this, it means you found them. It means you know about Liam and Leo. I've imagined this moment 1,000 times, wondered what you'd feel, what you'd do, whether you'd be angry that I hid them or relieved that you never had to choose. I'm writing this from the hospital. The doctors say I have maybe 4 months. I'm not afraid of dying, Harold. I'm afraid of leaving them alone. But I'm more afraid of what happens if you find them and nothing changes. You're going to want to protect them. I know you. You'll surround them with guards and guns and all the armor you've built your life on. You'll think that's love. That's safety. But Harold, that's the cage I spent 6 years running from. If you ever find them, let them be your reason to change, not your excuse to stay the same. You always thought love made you weak. You told me that the night I left, remember? You said caring about people made you vulnerable, made you a target. You were wrong. Love was the only thing that ever made you human. It was the only time I saw the man you could have been, the man I married before the empire swallowed him whole. Don't let Liam and Leo grow up afraid of their father. Don't let them inherit your violence, your paranoia, your enemies. They deserve sunlight, Harold, not shadows. If you can't give them that, if you can't walk away from who you've become, then please let them go. Let them remember you as a stranger who visited their mother's grave, not as the man who destroyed what's left of their childhood. But if you can change, if there's any part of the man I love still alive in there, then fight for it. Not with guns, not with power, with choice. Choose them over everything else. Choose the life you could have had over the empire you built instead. They need a father, Harold, not a king, not a killer, just a dad. I loved you once. Part of me never stopped. Prove me right about you. Just once, Grace. The letter slipped from Harold's hands and drifted to the desk. He sat frozen, Grace's words echoing in his skull like gunshots. Choose them over everything else. The woman he'd driven away, who died alone protecting their children from him, was giving him one last chance to become something other than what he was. Something broke inside him, something fundamental and load-bearing, and in its place something else began to grow. Harold stood slowly, walked to his wall safe, and pulled out his personal weapon, a Glock he'd carried for 15 years. He stared at it for a long moment, then set it on the desk. He picked up his phone and called Vincent. "I need you to do something," Harold said, his voice eerily calm. "Name it. Remove every weapon from this house. Every gun, every knife that isn't for cooking, everything. I want them gone by tonight." Silence, then. "Harold, what's going on?" "I'm making a choice." Over the next 2 weeks, Harold dismantled his empire piece by piece. He called in his street lieutenants and disbanded 3 crews outright, paying them severance like legitimate employees. He sold off 2 nightclubs and a gambling operation to neutral parties. He burned ledgers and destroyed records of deals that could never see daylight. His men watched in confusion and growing concern. Whispers spread that Harold Bruce had lost his edge, that grief or guilt had finally broken him. Vincent confronted him in his now empty office, weapons removed, walls bare. "They think you're weak," Vincent said bluntly. "The Vaselis, the Koreans, even our own people. Word is you've gone soft." Harold looked up from the documents he was signing. Transfer of ownership for a legitimate construction company, one of the few clean businesses he owned. "What do you think?" Vincent studied him. "I think you're the scariest I've ever seen you, because for the first time in 20 years, you actually give a damn about something." He paused. "You really doing this? Walking away from everything?" "Not walking away," Harold said quietly. "Walking towards something better." "The boys." "The boys," Harold confirmed. He looked at Vincent, his oldest friend, his most trusted advisor. "Grace was right. I built this empire because I thought power would protect me from ever being hurt again. But all it did was guarantee I'd die alone." He gestured to the empty office. "I finally have something worth more than all of this, and I'm not going to lose it because I was too proud to change." Vincent was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "You're going to need help. The kind that doesn't carry guns." "I know. Do you have any idea how to be a father?" Harold smiled sadly. "Not even a little, but I'm going to figure it out." Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm of commerce and crime. But inside Harold Bruce's fortress, something unprecedented was happening. A king was learning to kneel, and a killer was learning what it meant to build instead of destroy. The attack came 3 weeks later, at 2:47 a.m. Harold had just finalized the sale of his last illegal operation, a shipping company that had moved everything from stolen goods to worse things he was trying to forget. He was in his study, surrounded by legal documents instead of weapons, when the first window shattered. Glass exploded inward. Then gunfire, rapid, professional, coordinated. Harold's instincts took over before his mind caught up. He dove behind his desk as bullets tore through the room, shredding the leather chair where he'd been sitting seconds before. His hand reached automatically for the weapon that used to be at his hip. Found nothing. "No guns? You chose no guns." "Vincent!" he shouted. His consigliere appeared in the doorway, low and moving fast, a weapon in his hand. East and west entrances, at least 8 men. Vaseli crew. He tossed Harold a pistol. "I know you went clean, but tonight you stay alive." Harold caught the gun, the weight familiar and terrible in his palm. Through the broken window, he could hear boots on gravel, tactical movements, the sound of men who'd done this before. But there was something else, a sound that made his blood turn to ice. Children crying. "The boys," Harold whispered, his heart stopping. "Vincent, tell me the boys aren't here." Vincent's face went pale. "You said you were picking them up tomorrow for the weekend." "I moved it up. Surprised them after school. They're in the guest room upstairs." The world narrowed to a single point of terrible clarity. His sons were in this house, and armed men were coming through the doors. Harold moved through his mansion like a ghost returning to haunt his own life. Every tactical instinct from 20 years of warfare awakened, the muscle memory of violence he'd tried to bury but could never truly kill. He could hear the attackers spreading through the first floor, professional and methodical. Vincent moved beside him, covering angles. There's a panic room off the master bedroom. Get the boys there. Lock it down. I'll hold them off. You'll die. Then I'll die buying you time. Vincent's voice was steady. Those kids need their father, Harold, not their father's body. Move. Harold grabbed his arm. When this is over, if I'm still breathing, I'm done. Completely done. No half measures. I know. Vincent smiled grimly. Now go to be a dad and get your kids out of hell. They separated at the stairs. Harold took them 3 at a time, his heart hammering. Behind him, he heard Vincent's weapon open up, heard shouts and return fire. The sound of his oldest friend going to war so Harold could save his sons. The guest room door was locked. Harold knocked. 3 quick raps, the pattern he'd taught them. It's me! Open up! The lock clicked. Liam's tear-streaked face appeared, Leo clinging to his brother behind him. We heard loud noises. I know. We're playing that pirate game again, remember? But this time it's very important you stay completely quiet. Can you do that? Both boys nodded, terrified but trying to be brave. Harold scooped them up, one in each arm, their small bodies trembling, and moved down the hallway toward the master bedroom. Behind him, the gunfire intensified. An explosion somewhere on the first floor shook the walls. The panic room was hidden behind a false wall in his closet. Reinforced steel, separate ventilation, supplies for 72 hours. Harold had installed it years ago for exactly this kind of scenario, never imagining the lives he'd be protecting would be the ones that mattered most. He set the boys inside, kneeling to their level. Listen to me very carefully. You're going to stay in here where it's safe. The door locks from inside. See this button? Press it once I close the door. Don't open it for anyone except me. If someone else tries to get in, there's a phone on the wall that calls the police directly. Where are you going? Leo's voice shook. Harold's throat tightened. He thought of Grace's letter. Don't let them grow up afraid of their father. But how could he protect them without becoming exactly what she'd feared? I'm going to make sure the pirates don't come upstairs, he said gently. But I promise, I'll come back for you. You promise? Liam asked, using the phrase Grace had apparently taught them for serious vows. Harold's vision blurred or uttered, promise. He kissed both their foreheads, the first time he'd done so, then sealed the door, heard the lock engage. Then Harold Bruce stood, checked his weapon, and walked back into the war. He found Vincent on the second-floor landing. Wounded but still fighting, 3 bodies at his feet. They're after the boys, Vincent grunted, clutching his shoulder. Heard them on comms. This isn't about killing you, it's about taking your sons. White-hot rage flooded Harold's veins. How many left? 4, maybe 5. Harold, Vincent grabbed his arm. Don't go back to what you were, not for this. Harold looked at his friend, bleeding, loyal, willing to die for a choice Harold had made. I'm not going back, he said quietly. I'm protecting my future. There's a difference. He moved down the stairs like death itself. The remaining attackers were professionals, but Harold had built this house. He knew every corner, every shadow, every angle, and he was no longer fighting for territory or pride. He was fighting for 2 6-year-old boys locked in a panic room, waiting for their father to keep his promise. The fight was brutal and efficient. Harold used the house itself as a weapon. Tight corners, blind spots, the intimate geography of home. When it was over, 4 men lay unconscious or incapacitated. Harold had avoided killing shots, though every instinct screamed otherwise. Don't let them grow up afraid of their father. The last attacker, younger, maybe 25, stared up at Harold with fear in his eyes. Tell Vasily, Harold said, his voice like gravel, that I'm out, completely out. But if he comes near my sons again, I'll forget every promise I made to be a better man. Tell him that's not a threat, it's a fact. He zip-tied the man and left him for the police sirens already screaming in the distance. Harold limped back upstairs, his body aching, his hands shaking with adrenaline crash. He knocked on the panic room, 3 quick raps. It's over, you're safe. The door opened. Two tear-stained faces looked up at him, then Liam and Leo both launched themselves forward, wrapping small arms around his waist. "You came back!" Leo sobbed into his shirt. "You promised and you came back." Harold sank to his knees, gathering them close, feeling their small hearts beating against his chest. His own eyes burned. "I'll always come back," he whispered. "Always. I promise." They stayed like that until the police arrived, until Vincent was loaded into an ambulance, until the chaos of the night finally began to settle. But as Harold sat in the back of a police car, not under arrest, but giving a statement, watching crime scene techs photograph his shot-up mansion, he made a decision that would change everything. This house, this empire, this entire life, it had to burn. Not metaphorically, probably actually burn. If Liam and Leo were ever going to be safe, Harold Bruce, the Mafia boss, had to die. And someone new, someone clean, had to rise from the ashes. Starting now. The social worker arrived the morning after the attack. Her name was Evelyn Arteta, late 30s, kind eyes that had seen too much, carrying a clipboard and a court order. She stood in what was left of Harold's mansion, surrounded by bullet holes and shattered glass, and delivered the news with professional sympathy. "Mr. Bruce, given the violent incident that occurred with the children present, and considering your background, the state is intervening. Liam and Leo will be placed in temporary custody pending a fitness hearing." Harold, who'd faced down armed men without flinching, felt his knees go weak. "You can't take them." "I don't have a choice." "Neither do you." Evelyn's voice softened. "I'm sorry. I know you're trying. But two children were in a house that came under armed attack. The state has an obligation." "I protected them." Harold's voice cracked. "They weren't hurt. Not a scratch." "This time," Evelyn met his eyes, "but can you guarantee there won't be a next time? Can you promise me that your past won't keep showing up with guns?" Harold opened his mouth, closed it. He couldn't make that promise, not yet. "The hearing is in 2 weeks," Evelyn said quietly. "If you want any chance of keeping them, I suggest you figure out who you're going to be. Because right now, the man on paper isn't fit to raise goldfish, let alone children." They took Liam and Leo that afternoon. The boys cried, reaching for Harold as a social worker led them to a car. "You promised," Leo sobbed. "You promised." "I'll get you back," Harold called after them, his voice breaking. "I swear to God, I'll get you back." Martha stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "This is what I warned you about," she said. "Your world destroys everything." "Then I'll destroy my world," Harold said, "whatever it takes." The courtroom was smaller than Harold expected. No jury, just a family court judge, the social workers, Martha in the gallery, and Harold standing alone at the defendant's table. His lawyer had advised him to hire a specialist, someone who could navigate family law and manage his image. Harold had fired him that morning. "If I'm going to do this," he'd told Vincent, "I'm doing it as myself, not hiding behind someone else's words." Vincent had looked at him like he was insane. "Harold, you're not exactly likable on your best day." "Then maybe it's time I learned to be." Now standing before Judge Patricia Morrison, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for not suffering fools, Harold felt more exposed than he'd ever been in his life. The state's attorney presented her case efficiently. Harold Bruce's criminal associations, the attack on his home, his history of violence, his complete unsuitability as a guardian. "Your Honor," she concluded, "Mr. Bruce may be the biological father, but biology doesn't make someone a parent. These children deserve safety and stability. They deserve a childhood free from fear. And that's something this man simply cannot provide." Judge Morrison looked at Harold. "Mr. Bruce, do you have representation?" "No, Your Honor, just myself." "Do you wish to respond to these allegations?" Harold stood. His hands weren't shaking anymore. He'd faced his demons in Grace's journal, in his son's tears, in the wreckage of his own choices. This was just the final confession. "Your Honor, everything the state said about me is true. I've hurt people. I've broken laws. I've built a life on violence and fear. For 20 years, I was exactly the kind of man children should be protected from." Martha's sharp intake of breath was audible. But 6 weeks ago, I found out I had sons. Two boys I never knew existed because their mother, my ex-wife, loved them enough to hide them from the monster I'd become. Harold's voice wavered. Grace died protecting them from me, and she was right to. Judge Morrison's expression was unreadable. But she left me a letter, Harold continued. She told me that if I ever found them, I had to choose. Choose who I wanted to be. Choose whether love was going to change me or just destroy them too. He took a breath. I can't change what I was. Every crime, every mistake, that's permanent. It's on paper, in police files, in people's memories. I own that. His voice grew stronger. But I can choose what my sons remember me as. I can choose what kind of man I am from today forward. I've dismantled my criminal enterprise, sold every illegal business, cut ties with every dangerous associate. I've removed weapons from my home. I've cooperated with law enforcement on ongoing investigations. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to earn the privilege of being their father. The courtroom was silent. I don't want them to inherit my power, Harold said quietly. I want them to inherit my peace. I don't want them to fear their father. I want them to know a man who chose love over everything he built because they were worth more than all of it combined. His voice broke. They are all that's left of the woman who believed that I could be better. The woman I failed in every way a man can fail someone he loves. I can't make that right. Grace is gone. Tears slid down his face. But I can prove her right. I can be the man she saw buried under all the violence. The man she wrote that letter to. The father she hoped I could become. Harold looked directly at Judge Morrison. I'm not asking you to trust me based on who I was. I'm asking you to give me the chance to show you who I'm choosing to be. For them. Because they deserve a father who fights for them. Not with guns, but with change. Real change. He sat down. The courtroom remained silent. Judge Morrison's eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. We'll recess. I'll deliver my decision in 3 days. Harold spent those 3 days in hell, waiting, praying to a God he wasn't sure listened to men like him, holding Grace's letter until the paper went soft. When the decision came, Harold stood alone in the courtroom once more. Judge Morrison looked at him for a long moment before speaking. Mr. Bruce, I've presided over family court for 17 years. I've seen countless people promise it to change. Most don't, most can't. She paused. But I've also learned that children don't need perfect parents. They need parents who show up, who will try, who chooses them every single day. Harold's heart hammered. Full custody is granted to Harold Bruce with supervised visitation for the first 6 months in mandatory parenting classes. One violation, one hint that you've returned to your former life, and we revisit this immediately. Harold's knees buckled. He caught himself on the table. Don't make me regret this, Judge Morrison said quietly. I won't, Your Honor, Harold whispered. I promise. Outside, Martha waited. For the first time since he'd met her, she didn't look angry. Grace would have liked what you said in there, she said softly. Don't prove us both wrong. Harold nodded, unable to speak. His sons were coming home. The warehouse sat on the edge of the industrial district, a monument to everything Harold had built and everything he was leaving behind. He arrived alone at midnight, no bodyguards, no Vincent, just Harold and the ghosts of 20 years. The building looked smaller than he remembered, almost ordinary in the darkness. But he knew what had happened within these walls. Deals brokered in blood, fortunes made on suffering. The machinery of an empire that had cost him everything that actually mattered. Harold stood before the entrance, keys in hand, and thought about Grace. She'd asked him once, early in their marriage, what he kept in this place. He'd told her it was just business storage. She'd looked at him with those knowing eyes and said, someday, Harold, you're going to have to choose between who you are and who you want to be. And I hope you choose right. He'd chosen wrong then. But tonight he was making a different choice. Harold unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell hit him immediately. Oil, metal, the faint copper tang of old violence. He walked through the empty space, his footsteps echoing. The crates were gone now, sold or destroyed. The equipment was dismantled. All that remained was the skeleton of what had been. From his jacket, he pulled out Grace's letter, the one he'd read 100 times, until the creases were soft and the ink slightly smudged from his fingerprints. He read it one final time in the dim light filtering through the high windows. Let them be your reason to change, not your excuse to stay the same. Harold carefully placed the letter on the concrete floor in the center of the warehouse. Then he pulled out a small container of accelerant and began pouring it across the space, methodical and thorough. The liquid pooled and spread, catching the moonlight like dark water. When he was finished, Harold stood at the entrance and pulled out a single match. "This is for you, Grace," he whispered. "For the man you believed I could be. For our sons." He struck the match. The flame caught immediately, racing across the accelerant in beautiful, terrible patterns. Within seconds, the warehouse was ablaze, flames climbing the walls and consuming everything. The past, the violence, the version of Harold Bruce that had chosen power over love. He stood in the parking lot and watched it burn. Orange light danced across his face. Smoke rose into the night sky like prayers he'd never learned to speak. And as the building collapsed in on itself, sending sparks spiraling upward, Harold felt something break loose in his chest, something heavy he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. He wasn't Harold Bruce, the Mafia boss, anymore. He was just Harold, just a father, just a man trying to build something instead of destroying. The fire department arrived 15 minutes later, but by then it was already over. One of the firefighters approached him. "You own this property?" "I did," Harold said. "Not anymore." The next morning it dawned clear and bright. Harold stood in the backyard of his new house, modest, suburban, the kind of place with a swing set and a garden that needed tending. So different from the fortress he'd left behind that it felt like stepping into someone else's life, except it was his life now. In the kitchen, pancakes sizzled on the griddle, slightly burnt on one side because he was still learning, but edible. Through the window he could see Liam and Leo chasing each other across the grass, their laughter carrying on the morning breeze. No bodyguards watching from the shadows. No weapons hidden in every room. No encrypted phones or emergency protocols. Just sunlight. Just children playing. Just normal. "Dad!" Leo called, tumbling over his own feet and landing in the grass with a giggle. "Dad, come play!" Dad. The word still caught him off guard sometimes, still felt too good to be true. But it was true. The court had made it official. Martha's supervised visits had gone well, and slowly, impossibly, Harold was becoming the father Grace had hoped for. He turned off the stove and walked outside, the morning air cool against his skin. Liam ran up and grabbed his hand, pulling him towards some elaborate game they had invented involving dragons and treasure. As Harold let himself be dragged across the lawn, his hand unconsciously went to his neck, to the tattoo there, dark ink against his skin. A crown of thorns he'd gotten 20 years ago, when he thought power was the only thing worth having. Grace used to trace it with her fingers, back when she still believed he could change. "You were right, Grace," Harold thought, watching his sons play in the sunlight. "Love didn't make me weak. It made me human. It made me a father." "Dad?" "You're not paying attention," Liam complained. "The dragon is supposed to be scary." Harold grinned. The expression still felt new on his face, but getting easier every day. Okay, how scary are we talking?" "Really scary," both boys shouted in unison. Harold roared and chased them across the yard, their delighted screams filling the air. He caught them both, swung them around while they shrieked with laughter, then collapsed with them on the grass, all three of them breathless and happy. Above them, clouds drifted across an impossibly blue sky. The world continued its endless turning. Somewhere, deals were being made. Empires were rising and falling. Men were choosing power over everything else. But here, in this small backyard with grass that needed mowing and pancakes burning on the stove, Harold Bruce had found something those men would never understand. Peace. Not the absence of war, but the presence of love. Not the silence of fear, but the music of children's laughter. Not the cold fortress of power, but the warm chaos of family. Liam rested his head on Harold's chest. "Dad, are you happy?" Harold looked down at his son, at both his sons, these two miracles Grace had given him. these two reasons to become better than he'd ever been. "Yeah, buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I really am." "Good," Leo mumbled, already half asleep in the morning sun. "Mommy would be happy too." Harold's vision blurred. He looked up at the sky, at the light filtering through the trees, and whispered words meant for someone who could no longer hear them, but maybe, somehow, still knew. "Thank you, Grace, for believing. For the letter, for them." His voice broke. "I'm trying, every day, I'm trying to be the man you saw in me." The wind moved through the trees, gentle and forgiving, carrying away the smoke of yesterday's fires. And in that moment, Harold Bruce, former king of a criminal empire, reformed sinner, imperfect father, finally understood what it meant to truly live, not in power or fear or control, but in love, in laughter, in the simple, sacred act of showing up for the people who need you most. The boys stirred, wanting breakfast. Harold stood, scooping them both up, carrying them toward the house where burnt pancakes and orange juice were waiting. Behind them, the open field stretched into the distance. No walls, no boundaries, just possibility. And somewhere, in the space between memory and hope, Grace smiled. Her boys were safe. And Harold had finally come home. Sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do isn't building an empire, it's burning one down for love. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to change. That redemption isn't about erasing the past, it's about choosing a different future. Subscribe for more stories about second chances, broken men becoming better fathers, and the transformative power of love. Because everyone deserves to believe that change is possible.